A face appears before anything else, not in scripture, not in history, but in memory. Light skin, soft features, straight hair falling to the shoulders, eyes that have been painted and repainted so many times they feel familiar before you even think to question them. And it doesn't matter if it's a church wall, a film, a painting, or a page in a book. The image is always the same, repeated across generations until it feels natural, until it feels like it belongs to the story itself. And before we go any further, stay with this, because by the end, you're going to understand why the image of Jesus the world believes in doesn't match history, and why, once his real context is put back into place, it becomes impossible to see him the same way again. Most people never stop to ask where that image came from, because they didn't choose it, they inherited it, and that's what makes it powerful. It arrives fully formed, without explanation, without alternatives, without doubt, presented as if it has always existed that way. And over time, repetition does its work, turning something constructed into something that feels unquestionable. Across continents, across cultures, across people who share no common language or history, the same face appears again and again, carried through centuries of art, reinforced through institutions, embedded so deeply into belief that separating the man from the image begins to feel almost impossible, and that consistency creates a kind of authority, not because it is proven, but because it is everywhere. But that is where the tension begins to form, because something this consistent, something this widespread, does not happen by accident. It is selected, repeated, preserved, while other possibilities disappear. And once you begin asking where it came from, the story shifts, because now you're no longer looking at faith alone. You're looking at construction, at how an image is built, maintained, and passed down until it feels like truth. And the moment you follow that question, it leads you somewhere unexpected. Because if this image is so central, so trusted, so widely accepted, then it should have a clear foundation in the original story. Something that explains why this face became the one the world remembers. Something that ties it directly to the man himself. And that is where everything starts to break open. Because when you go back to the source, when you strip everything down to the earliest accounts, to the texts that are supposed to anchor everything that came after, the certainty disappears almost immediately. Not gradually, not partially, but completely, because there is no clear physical description, no defined features, no direct record that tells you what Jesus actually looked like. The Gospels move through his life, his teachings, his movements across regions, his interactions with people, but they never pause to describe his appearance in a way that would allow that familiar image to be reconstructed from the text itself. And that absence is not a small detail. It is a gap at the center of the entire visual story. There is no confirmed portrait from his lifetime, no contemporary image that can be traced back to him, no visual evidence that locks in a single definitive appearance, and yet, despite that, the image the world carries is incredibly specific, incredibly consistent, incredibly certain, as if it came directly from the source, when in reality it did not. And that is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because if the image is not grounded in scripture, not preserved from his lifetime, not described in any reliable way, then its authority does not come from history. It comes from something else, something that happened after, something that shaped how he would be seen long after he was gone. Once that realization settles in, the question changes. It is no longer, what did he look like? In the sense of confirming an image, it becomes, why does the world see him this way? And that question cannot be answered without stepping out of the image entirely and into the world he actually lived in. A world that looks very different from the one most people imagine. The story moves out of paintings and into geography, into a real place that can be mapped, walked, understood, And the moment you place it there, the image people carry starts to feel out of place almost immediately. Because Jesus was not born into a European world. He lived in Roman Judea, a region that sits at the intersection of Africa and Asia, a land shaped by movement, trade, migration, and constant interaction between surrounding regions that do not resemble the isolated image that came later. This is not a distant, disconnected corner of the world. It is part of a larger network where people, goods, and ideas move between North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, where Egypt stands as one of the most powerful and influential regions nearby. Not as a side detail, but as a central presence in the world he was born into. And once you understand that, the frame begins to shift, because now you are no longer imagining a figure detached from his environment. You are placing him inside a real population, among real people shaped by that geography. The climate, the movement of people, the shared cultural and regional connections all point in one direction, toward a world that is far removed from the European imagery that would later define him. And this is where the tension deepens, because the more accurately you place him in his real environment, the harder it becomes to reconcile that with the image that has been repeated for centuries. This is not about speculation. It is about context, about understanding that people reflect the regions they come from, that appearance is not abstract. It is shaped by geography, by population, by the world someone is born into, and once that context is restored, the familiar image begins to feel less like a reflection of history and more like something that was added later. Something that replaced what would have been far more consistent with the world he actually lived in. And just as that realization begins to settle, the story moves even closer to Africa itself, not as a distant influence, not as a background detail, but as a direct part of his life, in a moment that is written into the text but rarely given the weight it carries. Because early in his life, before any teachings, before any following, before any of the events that define the story most people know, there is a decision made for survival, a movement that takes him out of Judea and into Egypt, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but physically, as a child taken across regions to escape danger into a place that was already established, already populated, already deeply connected to the world he was part of. Egypt at that time was not a distant or unfamiliar land. It was a major center of culture, trade, and population, with established Jewish communities and infrastructure that made it a place of refuge. And this movement is not a minor detail. It is one of the earliest recorded moments in his life, placing him directly within an African context at a critical point in his story. And yet, despite its importance, this part is often treated as a passing moment, something acknowledged but not fully explored, something mentioned but not connected to the broader question of who he was and where he belonged in the world. And that absence matters because it removes a key piece of context that would otherwise reshape how the story is understood. Because when you take that movement seriously, when you place it back into its full weight, it reinforces the reality that his life was not confined to a narrow, isolated setting. It was part of a broader region where Africa was not separate, not distant, but directly connected, directly involved, part of the same world that shaped everything around him. And once that connection is restored, once Africa is no longer treated as an afterthought, but as part of the structure of the story itself, the question becomes harder to ignore, because the more accurately you place him in his real world, the more the familiar image begins to fall apart, and the more you are forced to confront what has been left out, not by accident, but by how the story has been told over time. Long before Christianity begins to take shape, long before the story spreads beyond its earliest followers, Africa is already part of a world that is structured, connected, and deeply developed, not waiting to be influenced, not empty, not undefined, but already operating with its own systems, its own traditions, its own intellectual and spiritual frameworks that existed independently of anything that would later arrive. Egypt stands as one of the clearest examples, not just as a neighboring region, but as a center of learning, administration, and religious complexity that had been established for centuries, influencing surrounding areas and connecting into broader networks that extended across the Mediterranean and into the Near East. And alongside it, regions like Nubia and Ethiopia developed their own organized societies, their own belief systems, their own internal structures that reflect a world already in motion. Jewish communities are already present within parts of Africa before Christianity spreads, creating a direct connection between the regions where Jesus lived and African societies that were not isolated from that world, but actively participating in it, exchanging ideas, traditions, and texts in ways that blur any simple separation between continents. And this matters because it disrupts a common assumption, the idea that Africa only enters the story later, as a recipient, as a place where religion is brought rather than a place that is already part of the environment where those ideas are forming and moving. Because in reality, Africa is not outside the story, it is already inside it, structurally, geographically, culturally. Once that is understood, the frame shifts again. Because now Africa is no longer a background detail. It becomes part of the foundation, part of the world that exists before Christianity spreads, shaping the conditions in which it develops. And that raises a deeper question, because if Africa was already present, already connected, already structured, then what role did it actually play once Christianity began to grow? Because when Christianity begins to spread beyond its earliest origins, it does not move in a single direction, it does not flow outward from one center into empty space, it moves along the same networks that already exist. And very early in that process, Africa becomes one of the most important regions where those ideas take root, develop, and expand. Egypt, and particularly the city of Alexandria, becomes a major center of Christian thought within the first centuries, not as a peripheral location, but as a place where ideas are debated, refined, and taught, where theology begins to take form in ways that will later influence the entire structure of the religion. And this is happening long before Europe becomes the dominant center of Christianity. Scholars, teachers, and communities in these regions are actively shaping how Christianity is understood, not just preserving it, but developing it, engaging with questions of doctrine, interpretation, and structure that will define the religion moving forward. And this process is not separate from the story, it is central to it. At the same time, Christianity is spreading through other parts of North and East Africa, embedding itself within societies that are already organized, already connected, creating communities that are not dependent on European influence, but part of an early network of believers that stretches across regions in ways that challenge the idea of a single origin point controlling everything. And this is where the narrative begins to shift more clearly, because Africa is no longer just part of the environment where Jesus lived, it becomes part of the development of Christianity itself, contributing to its structure, its ideas, its spread, and yet this role is often minimized, placed in the background, treated as secondary, when in reality it was foundational. And once that realization sets in, it pushes the story forward into an even deeper layer. Because if Africa played a role not just in context, but in shaping the religion, then the question becomes harder to ignore. How did that influence get reduced, reshaped, or overshadowed as the center of power began to move elsewhere? What begins as presence turns into authority, and not quietly, not in the margins, but at the center of how Christianity is actually being formed. Because in the early centuries of the faith, some of the most influential thinkers, writers, and debaters emerge from North Africa, shaping ideas that will later be treated as foundational across the entire religion. This is where doctrine is argued, refined, defined, not in isolation, but in intellectual environments that are active, rigorous, and deeply engaged with the questions that will determine how Christianity understands itself. And these debates are not minor. They address core concepts, belief structures, interpretations that become standard, repeated, institutionalized across regions far beyond where they were first developed. Figures from these regions are not simply participants. They are central voices contributing to the structure of theology in ways that ripple outward, influencing how Christianity is taught, practiced, and understood. And this is happening before Europe becomes the dominant force within the religion, before the shift in power begins to reshape the narrative. And yet, over time, these contributions are often repositioned, acknowledged but not emphasized, present but not centered, as if the development of the religion naturally moved elsewhere, when in reality it was already deeply shaped in these African contexts from the beginning. This is not about adding Africa into the story, it is about recognizing that it was already there, already active, already shaping the outcome in ways that are difficult to ignore once they are placed back into focus. And the more clearly this influence is seen, the more the traditional narrative begins to feel incomplete, not false in every part, but missing key elements that change how the entire structure is understood. And just as that realization takes hold, the story moves further, not into influence alone, but into continuity, into a place where Christianity develops in a way that does not follow the path that will later dominate the global image of the faith. Because while the center of power is still shifting, while structures are still forming elsewhere, Ethiopia adopts Christianity as a state religion in the 4th century, not as a reflection of European authority, but as part of its own internal development, creating a tradition that evolves independently with its own interpretations, its own practices, its own continuity that does not rely on external control. This is not a temporary adoption. It becomes embedded, sustained across centuries, maintaining a form of Christianity that exists alongside, but not under, the structures that will later dominate in Europe, and that independence matters, because it shows that the religion did not move in a single direction. It did not originate in one place and spread outward in a straight line. It developed across multiple regions at the same time, each contributing in different ways. The Ethiopian tradition preserves texts, interpretations, and practices that differ from what becomes standard elsewhere, reflecting a continuity that stretches back through its own historical path, uninterrupted by some of the shifts that reshape Christianity in other regions, and this creates a parallel narrative, one that exists alongside the dominant story but is rarely given the same level of visibility. And this raises a deeper tension, because if one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions exists outside of European control, if it developed independently and sustained itself over time, then the idea that Christianity is fundamentally European in origin or structure becomes harder to maintain, because the evidence points to something far more complex, far more distributed, far more rooted in regions that are often treated as secondary. At this point, the pattern becomes clearer. Africa is not an addition to the story. It is part of its structure, part of its development, part of its continuity. And yet, as the narrative continues, something shifts, something that will begin to reshape not just the power structure of Christianity, but the image that the world comes to associate with it. The change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't arrive with a single decision or a clear turning point. It unfolds gradually as Christianity moves from a network of communities into an institution tied to empire. And once that connection forms, the center of influence begins to shift, not just geographically, but structurally. Because power starts to concentrate in places that can organize, standardize, and enforce a unified version of belief. As Christianity becomes aligned with the Roman Empire, authority becomes more centralized, doctrine becomes more regulated, hierarchy becomes more defined, and the fluid, regionally diverse development that once allowed multiple centers of influence begins to narrow into something more controlled, more uniform, more directed from the top down. This is not simply expansion, it is consolidation. A process where certain interpretations are elevated, others are minimized, where decisions about structure, belief, and representation begin to carry more weight because they are now backed by institutional power. And that shift changes how the story is preserved, how it is transmitted, how it is ultimately understood. Regions that once played central roles, including those in Africa, do not disappear, but their position changes, their influence becomes less visible within the dominant narrative as the center moves north and west. And with that movement comes a new phase in how Christianity is presented, not just in theology, but in imagery, in representation, in the visual language that begins to accompany the story. And this is where the transformation begins to take a form that is easier to recognize. Because once power settles into a new region, the way the story is told begins to reflect that region more closely, not as a deliberate break from the past, but as a gradual alignment between authority and representation. At first, the image is not fixed. Early depictions of Jesus vary across regions, reflecting the diversity of the communities that represent him. Sometimes darker, sometimes lighter, sometimes abstract, sometimes symbolic. But as the center of power continues to move into Europe, that variation begins to narrow, not abruptly, but steadily, as certain visual forms are repeated more often, preserved more consistently, and eventually treated as standard. Art becomes one of the main vehicles for this shift. Paintings, icons, sculptures, each reinforcing a particular version of the image, one that aligns more closely with European features, and as these works are reproduced, displayed, and circulated, they begin to shape perception in a way that text alone never could. Over time, repetition does its work again. The same process that made the image feel natural in the first place now locks it in more firmly, because the more it is seen, the less it is questioned, the more it is accepted as an accurate reflection rather than a regional interpretation that became dominant through power and distribution. This is not about a single moment where the image changes. It is about accumulation, about how consistent exposure over centuries replaces variation with uniformity, until the version that reflects one region becomes the version the entire world recognizes, and alternatives fade into the background, not because they were disproven, but because they were not repeated at the same scale. And this is where the connection between power and imagery becomes clear, because the shift in how Jesus is depicted follows the shift in where authority is concentrated, and once those two align, the image begins to carry the weight of the institution behind it, reinforcing itself across generations, across continents, until it becomes almost inseparable from the story itself. Once the image is set, it doesn't stay contained. It moves, carried alongside expansion, embedded into churches, printed into texts, painted into walls, repeated across continents as Christianity spreads far beyond Europe. And with that movement, the image becomes more than representation. It becomes the default, the version people receive before they ever ask a question. It travels through colonization, through missions, through institutions that bring not just belief, but visual identity with them. And wherever the religion goes, the image follows, consistent, reinforced, rarely challenged, until it begins to feel universal, not tied to any one region, but accepted everywhere, as if it had always belonged that way. Over time, repetition replaces variation completely, because when one image dominates long enough, alternatives don't just become less common, they become invisible. And generations grow up seeing the same face without ever being shown that other interpretations existed, that earlier depictions reflected different regions, different contexts, different understandings of who Jesus might have looked like. And that is how the image becomes fixed, not through a single decision, but through scale, through reach, through constant exposure that turns one version into the version until it feels inseparable from the story itself, even though it arrived long after the story began. By the time that image reaches global dominance, the gap between representation and reality is already in place. But it is no longer obvious because the image has been normalized to the point where it no longer feels like a version, it feels like truth, and that is where the disconnect becomes most powerful because it hides in plain sight. Jesus lived in a region shaped by the Middle East and deeply connected to Africa. His early life includes movement into Egypt. His world exists within a population that does not resemble the image that later became standard, and early Christianity itself is shaped in part by African centers of influence. Yet none of that is reflected in the face most people recognize. The geography points one way, the historical context points one way, the development of early Christianity points one way, and the image points somewhere else entirely. And that separation is not accidental, it is the result of how the story was carried, who carried it, and how it was reshaped over time. Once you see that gap clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore because it is not a small difference, it is a structural one, a difference between where the story began and how it was later presented to the world. At this point, the question itself needs to be reframed because it is often asked in a way that suggests there should be a single, definitive answer, a confirmed image that can settle everything. But that is not what history provides. There is no verified portrait, no preserved likeness that can be pointed to as final. Instead, what exists is context, geography, population, patterns of human appearance shaped by region, and when those elements are taken seriously, the question shifts from certainty to probability, from was he exactly this to what would be most consistent with the world he lived in. And when you follow that line honestly, without the weight of inherited imagery, the answer begins to move away from the familiar and towards something else, something that aligns more closely with the region, the environment, the people who lived there, something that no longer fits the image that has been repeated for centuries. This is not about replacing one fixed image with another equally rigid one. It is about recognizing that the dominant image does not come from the time or place of Jesus. It comes from a later process that shaped how he would be seen. There is no confirmed image of Jesus that remains unchanged, but what does change is how the story is understood once its full context is restored. Because when you place him back into his real world, into the geography he lived in, into the population that surrounded him, into the regions that influenced his life and the early development of Christianity, the familiar image no longer holds the same authority. The version that dominates today is not supported by direct historical evidence. It is supported by repetition, by tradition, by the structures that carried it across time. And once that is clear, the idea that it represents historical reality becomes harder to maintain. Instead, what emerges is a figure rooted in a world that is far closer to Africa and the Middle East than to Europe. a context that suggests a very different appearance than the one most people have been shown, not as a definitive replacement, but as a more historically grounded understanding of where he belongs. And once that context is fully seen, the shift is not just visual, it changes how the entire story is interpreted, because it removes the illusion that the image was neutral and reveals that it was shaped, selected, and preserved in ways that reflect history as much as belief. The story was never empty, it was never lacking detail, it was incomplete, shaped over time in ways that emphasized certain elements while leaving others in the background. And the image people recognize today is part of that process. Not an untouched reflection of the past, but a version that became dominant through repetition and power. Restoring the missing context does not erase belief, it clarifies it. It places the story back into the world it came from, a world where Africa is not distant but connected, not secondary but present, part of the structure that shaped everything from the beginning. And once that connection is understood, the question is no longer just about what Jesus looked like. It becomes about how history, power, and representation work together to shape what people accept as truth. Because the image that feels most familiar is not always the one closest to reality. It is often the one that was repeated the most.